Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Whew! It's been intense getting everything set back up. My Mac was had to be motherboard repaired because of a lightning bolt striking our land right outside my office. So I'm actually back with my Mac, which of course got wiped, and so I had to set everything back up. And as a result, if you look up there, you can see the animation, little subtle animation of that background painting, which stopped working a long time ago, and I didn't know why. And now I don't know why it's working again, but I'm glad. Anyway, glad to be back. Share with friends and like. I never say that. There, I said it. And support for the show gratefully received on Subscribestar, which is in the YouTube video link. And most people subscribe for a measly $5 a month, but it lets me pay for various expenses for the show and not steal food from the mouths of my babes, my 8 children. So some of them aren't that young anymore. But anyway, what do I want to say? That's it. Let's get going. Before we continue with this walkthrough of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt, which is part of this series on the Specialest Relationship. I don't intend for it to be the only thing I do, by the way. I have an intention to bring in some ringers to cover some things that Mearsheimer and Walt, I wouldn't say they don't get into it, but they only get into it a tiny bit, and there's a lot more to be said on it, on certain key aspects of the relationship between the two countries. So, yeah, I just wanted to tell a story that came to mind reading this, preparing for this show. In after the Iraq War in 2003, I guess the second Iraq War, technically, when the U.S. fully invaded and just took Iraq over, I was at a Christian event, a public Christian event, and an anguished young man said he had been in the Iraq War, and he was having a spiritual crisis. That's why he was at this gathering. And he said he'd been at the Iraq War, and he was like, basically one of those, it was a problem of evil moment. How can there be a God when horrible things like this happen, or in this case, when I do such horrible things? Because he said that in the Iraq War, he was just, I forget how he described it. He was just like using a tank or shoveling sand and just wiping out Iraqi soldiers, just shoveling, riding over them or shoveling. I don't remember the detail, but, it was not exactly a great warrior moment. And he felt terrible about it. He felt like what he'd done was not for the reasons he thought it was. Remember 9/11, and, they hit America, we're going to hit back. And then it turned out that maybe attacking Iraq didn't have very much to do with 9/11. So, he questioned why he was there. He questioned what he had done. And that came back to my mind last night as I was preparing this material, that young man. That was a long time ago, right? 20 years ago, he wouldn't be young anymore, but he came to my mind. So let's hit this. And the second half of the book, so in the first half, described how the lobby works, some of the rhetorical devices, the organizational structure of the Israel lobby, how it is effective in having a really dominant control of Congress, Israel occupied territory, as somebody put it, and then also has an effect on public opinion and on the executive. In the marketing for this, I highlighted the impact on the executive, because in these two stories, that's what really struck me, was watch for what happens in these next two chapters. The president has this idea that he's going to do something in the Middle East, and then that goes away magically. That idea disappears, and we find out who the real master is of the situation, right? So let's get into it. And thanks to FBI Informant, he says, this has been an excellent series thus far. I'd always been meaning to read Mearsheimer's book. And of course, I don't think I'm fooling anyone. Part of what I do with this show is get myself to finally, under the pressure of producing the show, get myself to actually hit some material that I've been meaning to hit for years, right? But I also, it's not random. I think this is quite relevant because of what's going on today. But let's see if we can learn from the past this week. Okay, so the first, First is just this introduction of this whole section of the lobby in action. The Israel lobby's influence would not be especially worrisome if its agenda were limited to making sure that Congress continued to provide foreign aid for the Jewish state. Although there might be better uses for this money, the U.S. is a wealthy country. We can afford about $3 billion at that time that it annually provides to Israel. But it also works to influence various aspects of U.S. foreign policy. And so the material aid that the U.S. provides, those direct handing money to Israel, is valuable. It's even more helpful to have the world's only superpower bring its vast capabilities to bear on Israel's behalf. No kidding. So what are the actual geopolitical interests of the United States in this area? 1, keeping Persian Gulf oil flowing to world markets. 2, discouraging the spread of weapons of mass destruction. And 3, reducing anti-American terrorism originating in the region, right? So the authors argue those are the real American interests in this region, the actual national interests of the country. But, and let's compare to that the effect of the lobby on the foreign policy of the U.S. Compare to those goals, those objectives, those main interests. What does the lobby end up doing? And does it further those 3 objectives, right? So, in addition to preserving U.S. aid to Israel, groups in the lobby have sought to ensure that American power is used to shape the Middle East environment in ways they believed would advance Israel's interests, especially in security. These groups favor using American power to deal with Israel's main regional adversaries, Iran, Iraq under Saddam, and Syria. Notice of that short list there, Iraq, as we're gonna cover today, has been dealt with. Syria was just dealt with. That was this year. Yeah, it was this year, right? Very recently. And then Iran, as you might have noticed, is once again being brought up as a target of regime change or something. So at the very least, the lobby wants America to contain these rogue states, make sure they don't acquire nuclear weapons. But some have gone further, advocating that the U.S. use its power to topple the regimes in Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and replace them with leaders willing to live peacefully with Israel. In the best of all possible worlds, Washington would transform the entire region by spreading democracy and drawing up support for terrorism against both the United States and Israel. James in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Finally, the lobby has pushed American leaders to disarm Hezbollah and help create a Lebanon that is friendly to Israel. Okay, so we have those 3 objectives that the authors think are, reasonable objectives for the United States: keeping oil flowing, stopping WMD, and stopping terrorism from the region. And then we have what the lobby has been pushing, which is regime change throughout, its neighbors, basically. All right. So the lobby made considerable progress pushing this agenda during the 1990s, even though, as we've covered in previous episodes, it was more difficult to make the case that Israel was a strategic asset for the U.S. after the Cold War. During the Cold War, you could say, it was helping us fight the Soviet Union or something. But then the Soviet Union went away, and, harder to make that argument that, we need Israel for some reason. Nevertheless, Israel did make some headway during the 1990s, in the post-Soviet period, right? Then came the big epic event in this story, the attacks of September 11th 2001. And this came the critical moment. Would the Bush administration conclude that close ties between the US and Israel were fueling anti-American terrorism? And would it therefore try to improve its image in the Arab and Islamic world by just distancing itself, even if only slightly, from Israel? Specifically, would President Bush put pressure on the Sharon government, Ariel Sharon at that time, prime minister, to end its efforts to colonize the West Bank and instead create a viable Palestinian state? And might the U.S. also begin to reduce its military presence in the Middle East, which had grown considerably since 1990? So that's one path that was open after 9/11, right? The United States might respond to the situation by returning to its earlier position as an offshore balancer in the Middle East, more like a neutral referee, right? And therefore it would press more vigorously for an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not crazy talk that in 2001, after these attacks, that this might be the way things go. The Reagan administration had briefly deployed U.S. troops in Lebanon in the early 80s, but then had removed them after a suicide bomber killed 241 Marines in Beirut. Presidents Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, had also made genuine progress toward peace in the region, but only by putting pressure on Israel and paying less attention to the lobby. So it's not like no American president has ever, snubbed the Israel lobby before. There's precedent for this with Reagan, Carter, Bush, right? But then there's another way things could go. Most of you know the end of the story here, which is that this could be an opportunity for the Israel lobby to push the U.S. to do some of the things that the Israel lobby wanted the U.S. to do. Namely, go after Hezbollah, Iran, Iraq, Syria, any of the above, all of the above, right? So Israel and key groups in the lobby began working together to turn the opportunity of September 11th into a reality, and their efforts succeeded. The Bush administration eventually embraced the lobby's views about the new threat environment and rejected the alternative paradigm, the paradigm that would mean distancing from Israel. American and Israeli leaders began to sound as if they were speaking from the same page. Right. So some people think that what happened back then is that Bush already saw the world the same way as Sharon, as Israel, and the lobby didn't really do much. It was just going to, because of 9/11, it was just going to go the way that it went. And Mearsheimer and Walt say that is not accurate history, and they are going to really demonstrate that here, both in this chapter and the next. It overlooks very real disagreements that occasionally emerge between the Bush administration and the Israeli government. In the first year after September 11th, Bush and Sharon clashed on a number of occasions over the Palestinian issue. But on both the Palestinian and Syrian issues, the lobby successfully pressured Bush to change course and to adopt its policy preferences instead. So you can see why, if you saw my marketing for this stream, why I marketed it the way I did. This is a tale of a president blinking. I won't use the other word we like to use on the internet. The president blinking, intending to go in one direction and being steered in another by the efforts of the Israel lobby. And there's various counter arguments to this. It was really about big oil and stuff like that. Mearsheimer and Walt are going to show you that Bush was intending to go in one direction, show you that what the lobby did to steer him in another direction. Not just the lobby, by the way, as we'll see, particularly in regards to Iraq, Israel officials. Okay, it wasn't just like American neoconservatives in the United States. Israel officials were weighing in and having an influence. So right. So sorry, what was I saying? So Bush wanted to go. George W. Bush wanted to go in a certain direction on Palestine, and the next chapter on Iraq. He was persuaded otherwise. Okay, and it wasn't because of big oil and so forth. Okay, so did the lobby exert a significant influence on U.S. Middle East policy? And if so, were the results beneficial for the United States or for Israel? The answer to the first question is clearly yes. The lobby had an influence. And we believe the answer to the second question is emphatically no. These things were not beneficial to the US, and they even argue they're not beneficial to Israel. I think that's a little more debatable, but I'm just going to state their case. Okay, so let's get into it. We're doing two things today: the lobby versus the Palestinians, and I guess I should use the actual chapter title, Iraq and dreams of transforming the Middle East. Okay, so Palestinians and Iraq are the two issues, and we're going to see where the administration was trying to go and how it got steered a different direction. Okay, now I'm passionate about this stuff, especially the next chapter on Iraq, because I lived through it. I was very politically aware by the time all this stuff went down. I'd been learning about political stuff, studying political stuff for some years at the point at September 11th, well enough, as I occasionally mention, that I actually predicted 9/11. So I was clued in to what was going down and why it was happening, right? And so I'm reading this, I'm taking me back in time as I'm watching the slow motion train wreck unfurl before my eyes, blow by blow, especially courtesy of Justin Raimondo's excellent coverage at antiwar.com. He really knew who the key players were. Scooter Libby, as we'll find out, etc., etc. Okay, so lobby versus Palestinians. Take a drink. So it's now largely forgotten, but in the fall of 2001, so after September 11th, and again in the spring of 2002, the Bush administration sought to reduce anti-American sentiment in the Arab and Islamic world by pressing Israel to halt its expansionist policies in the occupied territories, and by advocating the creation of a Palestinian state. Anyone remember that? I think I had forgotten. Following the attacks, American policymakers believed that shutting down the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or at least making a serious attempt to do so, would undermine support for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and facilitate the building of an international coalition against terrorism, which might even include states like Iran and Syria. Yet, the Bush administration was unable to persuade Jerusalem to change its policies, and Washington instead ended up backing Israel's hardline approach toward the Palestinians. Okay, so it started by saying, hey, it's in the interest of the US that Israel cool it with Palestine because it's making everybody mad and they're attacking and killing Americans, right? And somehow that got flipped to go Israel, crush the Palestinians. How'd that happen? Washington Post headline in February 2003. So this is what, about a year and a half after 9/11. 2003 summarized the situation. Bush and Sharon nearly identical on Mideast policy. So let's start in late September 2001. Bush began pushing Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to show restraint in the occupied territories, do everything possible to contain the violence of the Second Intifada. The administration put what the New York Times described as enormous pressure on Sharon to allow Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres to meet with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, even though Bush was highly critical of Arafat's leadership. In early October, the new American president said publicly for the first time that he supported a Palestinian state. That's a big deal. If you're going to get the support of the Israel lobby, you don't talk about support for a Palestinian state, right? And Sharon was not very politic about rejecting all this. Bush was angry at Sharon, likening Bush's actions to Neville Chamberlain's capitulation at Munich. Can you imagine comparing something all these decades later to 1939 and Neville Chamberlain? It's weird, isn't it? Sharon and the pro-Israel lobby moved quickly to resolve the growing dispute between Bush and Sharon by convincing the Bush administration and the American people that the U.S. and Israel faced a common threat from terrorism. Earlier in the book and in this series, we discuss this argument that the U.S. and Israel, they face the same threat. They should be united in fighting terrorism because it's basically the same thing they're dealing with. And Mearsheimer and Walt, I thought, did a good job of destroying that argument. As Sharon told a self-described longtime supporter, the columnist William Safire of the New York Times in December 2001, you in America are in a war against terror. We in Israel are in a war against terror. It's the same war. Okay? So aligning the interests of the two states there. Sharon had a telephone conversation with American Jewish leaders on September 14th, so this is 3 days after 9/11, in which he made it clear that he was worried the Bush administration would treat Arafat differently from bin Laden, and that Bush would try to be tough on Israel as a way of winning Arab support for the war on terrorism. Sharon asked these leaders for their help. In that uncertain moment, the Project for the New American Century released an open letter to Bush on September 20th. So things move very fast, as you'll notice, after 9/11. These things are happening within a week, within 2 weeks of the attacks. People are putting things in gear here, right? So Project for the New American Century, or PNAC for short. I remember hearing that acronym so many times back then. It was signed by many neoconservatives. And I'm going to be reading lists of names because, and you'll hear the same names over and over, because these names should go down in infamy, in my view. So some of the neocons who signed this open letter: William J. Bennett, Elliot Cohen, Aaron Friedberg, Rule Mark Garrecht, Robert Kagan, Charles Krauthammer, Jean Kirkpatrick, William Crystal, Richard Pearl, Norman Podhoretz. So what was in the letter? It described Israel as America's staunchest ally against international terrorism, called for the president to fully support our fellow democracy, and it recommended that the U.S. cut off all support for the Palestinian Authority. Do you feel like there was a leap in logic there? Like, what does cutting off support for the Palestinian Authority have to do with any of that? Anyway, or, with fighting 9/11 and terrorism and stuff like that. Okay, the lobby worked the halls of Congress. On November 16th, so this is 2 months later, 89 senators sent Bush a letter praising him for refusing to meet with Arafat until the Palestinian leader took the necessary steps to end the violence against Israel. According to the New York Times, the letter stemmed from a meeting 2 weeks ago between leaders of the American Jewish community and key senators, adding that AIPAC was particularly active in providing advice on the letter. By late November, relations between Jerusalem and Washington had improved considerably. This was due in part to the lobby's efforts, but also to America's initial victory in Afghanistan, which reduced the perceived need for Arab support in dealing with al-Qaeda. So, as the authors emphasize here, they do think that the Israel lobby's influence was really key to the behavior of the U.S. government in regards to the Palestinians, and especially in regards to Iraq. But it's not the only factor going on. It's just that they believe it's a sine qua non. The U.S. would not have invaded Iraq without the Israel lobby. But also, the Israel lobby had been pushing for these things throughout the 90s and weren't getting them. 9/11, invasion of Afghanistan, various events occurred that helped them to progress agendas that they'd been trying for a decade and had not gotten anywhere with, and suddenly they're making progress on these agendas, right? So it's a confluence of events and the Israel lobby taking advantage of those events. I guess let's put it that way. Okay, this next section, have to read the title. The lobby humiliates Bush. So tension erupted between America and Israel when violence kicked off again in Palestine, or ratcheted up. It never seems to stop, but it ratcheted up. In late March 2002, a Hamas suicide bomber killed 30 Israelis at a Passover Seder. The Palestinian Authority denounced the attack, pledged to prosecute those responsible. But Sharon didn't think that was, enough of a response. And so he launched Operation Defensive Shield, in which IDF resumed control of virtually all of the major Palestinian areas on the West Bank. Bush knew right away that Israel's actions would damage America's image in the Arab and Islamic world and undermine the war on terrorism. So he demanded on April 4th that Sharon halt the incursions and begin withdrawal. He underscored this message 2 days later, saying this meant withdrawal without delay. On April 7th, Bush's National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice told reporters that without delay means without delay. It means now. So Bush is like sending an order to Sharon. You do this, right? I'm skipping a lot of detail they give, supporting detail about, all the different people that weighed in and neoconservative journalists and so forth. This did catch my attention. David Brooks, working for the Weekly Standard, he's denouncing a trip by Colin Powell, which was meant to, push for this change in Israeli behavior. And he said Powell hurt U.S. prestige, shredded U.S. policy in the Middle East, and most importantly, he hurt our moral clarity. This use of the phrase moral clarity and moral equivalence, that's another one, has always struck me. I remember it striking me back then. It's an interesting bit of rhetorical manipulation, I think. Okay, so the pressure came on Bush. A group of evangelical leaders led by the Reverend Jerry Falwell and former presidential candidate Gary Bauer sent Bush a letter demanding that the administration end pressure on Sharon to withdraw from the West Bank. After Falwell adjured his followers to do the same, the White House was flooded with calls and emails. The next day, sources say, senior presidential aides phoned Falwell to reassure him that Bush stood behind Sharon. So as discussed previously, the Christian Zionists, the evangelicals who support Israel, are also part of the Israel lobby. The first external sign that Bush was caving came that same day, April 11th, only 1 week after he insisted that Sharon withdraw his forces, when Ari Fleischer said the president believed that Sharon was a man of peace. Bush himself repeated this statement on April 18th, on Powell's return from his abortive mission, and the president told reporters that Sharon had responded satisfactorily to his call for a full and immediate withdrawal. Sharon had done no such thing, but Bush was no longer willing to make an issue of it. On May 2nd, Congress overrode the administration's objection and passed 2 resolutions reaffirming support for Israel. The Senate vote was 94-2. The House version passed 352-21. Both resolutions emphasize that the U.S. stands in solidarity with Israel, that the two countries are, to quote the House resolution, now engaged in a common struggle against terrorism. The House version also condemned the ongoing support of terror by Yasser Arafat, who is portrayed as a central element of the terrorism problem. So Sharon and the lobby had taken on the President of the United States and his Secretary of State and had triumphed. A journalist in an Israeli newspaper reported that Sharon's aides could not hide their satisfaction in view of Powell's failure. Sharon saw the white in President Bush's eyes, they bragged, and the president blinked first. Indeed, Bush's humiliation was not lost on commentators around the world. Spain's leading daily newspaper said, if a country's weight is measured by its degree of influence on events, the superpower is not the USA, but Israel. Let that sink in. Um, then I'm not going to go into the details, but Bush gave a major speech in the spring of 2002, June 24th. He said Arafat had to give up power before the peace process could move forward. Peace requires a new and different political Palestinian leadership. In Haaretz, David Landau said Yasser Arafat, the seemingly immortal leader of the Palestinian national movement, was politically assassinated by President George W. Bush. So that was worth noting. Shortly after the president, let's see, I'm jumping forward in time here. Bush had a trip to the Middle East in early June 2003, widely seen as an important step in promoting the president's peace effort. Shortly after the president returned to the U.S., Israel tried but failed to kill Abdel Aziz Rantizi, a key Hamas leader. It was the first of 7 targeted assassinations in 5 days. So Bush takes a trip to make peace, and Israel starts assassinating people, right? Israel commentators understood that the Israeli prime minister was now attempting to seek the roadmap, the roadmap to peace. The curious thing, timing of the assassination campaign, a Haaretz correspondent wrote, was not lost on Israelis. So Bush wasn't pleased, but he only mildly rebuked Sharon. But even the slightest criticism of Israel was unacceptable to the hardliners in the lobby, who soon mobilized to check Bush's brief show of independence. I mean, as we've talked about, we talk about the left, that they don't spend time celebrating victory; they push harder, right? Well, you see this behavior here with the Israel lobby. They don't go, oh, good, Bush is relaxing from the strong statements he was making about Sharon. He mildly rebuked Sharon. That's no big deal. No. Not even a mild rebuke is allowed. They go after him for that. They just constantly pushing, pressing. Right? Bush had once again tried to curb Israeli actions that strengthened anti-Americanism in the Arab and Islamic world and undermined the administration's war on terrorism, but he ended up suffering another humiliating defeat. Let's see. I'm skipping around a bit on the Palestine chapter, mostly because we're living it, so I don't need to go through tons of detail here. Let's see. Oh, I thought this was an interesting comment on how American democracy, is viewed in Israel by the Israeli leadership. As one senior Israeli official put it, we are not under any pressure. The United States is a very vibrant democracy, and this is a very politically oriented administration. Reality is made sometimes by political constraints. That is, democracy allows the Israel lobby to get what they want out of the U.S. government. So, another point for democracy there, right? Okay, let's see. Let's see, in the spring of 2004, in a dramatic shift, on April 14th, Bush reversed the stated policy of every president since Lyndon Johnson by proclaiming that Israel would not have to return virtually all of the territories that it occupied in 1967, and that Palestinian refugees would not be allowed to return to their former homes in Israel, but would have to settle in a new Palestinian state. So it's kind of amazing to think that for, what is that? Over 30 years, U.S. presidents had been very consistent in not accepting the territories occupied in 1967 until George W. Bush, and he finally backed off that position. And I don't think Trump, for one, is going to go back to that old position, to say the least. Previously, American policy was that the Israelis and the Palestinians would negotiate these issues. But now the president said, now Israel doesn't have to negotiate about that land, right? These moves sparked outrage in the Middle East, but were widely seen in the U.S. as smart politics in a year when George Bush was up for re-election. There's that benefit of democracy again, right? Writing in early 2004, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times captured the essence of Bush's predicament regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mr. Sharon has the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat under house arrest in his office in Ramallah, and he's had George Bush under house arrest in the Oval Office. Mr. Sharon has Mr. Arafat surrounded by tanks, and Mr. Bush surrounded by Jewish and Christian pro-Israel lobbyists, by a vice president, Dick Cheney, who's ready to do whatever Mr. Sharon dictates, and by political handlers telling the president not to put any pressure on Israel in an election year, all conspiring to make sure the president does nothing. Once again, it mentions Israel continued to assassinate Palestinian leaders, sometimes at the most unhelpful moments, at least from a U.S. perspective. On March 22, 2004, Israel assassinated Hamas leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin with American-made Hellfire missiles. This move was generally perceived as a serious blow to America's position in the Middle East, not only because U.S. weapons were used, but also because many in the Arab world believed that the Bush administration had given Israel the green light to kill a paraplegic in a wheelchair. Let's see, I'm not drawing anything from this section. Arafat dies and nothing changes. Rice gets paralyzed. Okay, yeah, like I said, I'm covering this chapter more lightly because the next chapter is what really interested me. So, concluding, absent the lobby, the Bush administration almost certainly would have been much more self-interested and hard-nosed in pushing for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. They highlight that this is not reflecting what the American people felt. So in spring of 2002, a Time CNN poll found 60% of Americans felt that U.S. aid to Israel should be cut off or reduced if Sharon refused to withdraw from the Palestinian areas he had recently occupied. 75% of those surveyed thought that Powell should meet with Arafat when he visited Israel. Regarding Sharon, only 35% found him trustworthy, while 35% thought he was a warmonger, 20% saw him as a terrorist, and 25% considered him an enemy of the United States. Then another poll, May 2003, now a year later, 73% said the U.S. should not favor either side in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Only 17% of respondents agreed with the claim made by Bush and Sharon that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is part of the war on terrorism. Instead, 54% viewed it as a conflict between national groups fighting over the same piece of land. Pretty good description, I think. Israel's ability to defy the United States and even to get Washington to follow its preferred approach to dealing with the Palestinians offers a classic illustration of interest group politics at work. Although public opinion polls show that the American people would support compelling Israel to offer the Palestinians a fair settlement, groups in the lobby, and especially its more hardline elements, care more about this issue than the average American does. As a result, groups like AIPAC and the leaders of organizations like the Conference of Presidents can put disproportionate pressure on elected officials, and their policy preferences are more likely to win out, even if they are bad for the U.S. as a whole and unintentionally harmful for Israel as well. Okay, so that's Palestinians. Bush is like, hey, this is contributing to everybody being mad at us, contributed to why 9/11 happened. We already went through that bin Laden himself personally was very motivated by what Israel was doing to the Palestinians and had been since he was young. So, it was part of the story of why 9/11 happened. So, one rational response would be to say, hey, maybe we need to cool some of this stuff off that's got people so mad that they're flying planes into our tallest buildings, right? But somehow the Israel lobby completely made Bush blink on that and eventually just back Israel to the hilt in even more than previous presidents had. Okay, so now, this is the chapter that really grabbed me. Israel and dreams of transforming the Middle East. Um, so why did the United States invade Iraq? In in a book, George Packer declares that it still isn't possible to be sure, and this remains the most remarkable thing about the Iraq War. He quotes Richard Haas, the director of policy planning in the State Department during Bush's first term and now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, saying that he would go to his grave not knowing the answer. Who knows, right? There were no convincing links between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. In fact, they were hostile to each other. Bin Laden and his associates were in Afghanistan or Pakistan, not Iraq. Yet, in the aftermath of 9/11, when one would have expected the U.S. to be focusing laser-like on al-Qaeda, the Bush administration chose to invade a deteriorating country that had nothing to do with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and was already effectively contained. Remember, there had already been a war with Iraq. There were these sanctions. Iraq was not out of control. It was, you know, it wasn't in the U.S. empire, but the U.S. empire had its thumb on it quite heavily. And yet that wasn't enough for the Israel lobby. So from that perspective, from the perspective of, hey, 9/11 happened, you'd think the U.S. would be doing this or this. Why'd they go off and do this other thing, right? It seems kind of puzzling what happened there. But from another angle, this decision is not hard to understand. In the period before the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the U.S. was simultaneously powerful, confident of its military prowess, and deeply worried about its own security. A dangerous combination, right? But there was another variable in the equation, and the war would almost certainly not have occurred had it been absent. That element was the Israel lobby, and especially a group of neoconservative policymakers and pundits who had been pushing the U.S. to attack Iraq since well before 9/11. Israeli officials and former Israeli leaders supported these efforts because they were eager to see the U.S. topple one of their main regional adversaries, and the man who had launched Scud missiles at Israel in 1991. Pressure from Israel and the lobby was not the only factor behind the Bush administration's decision to attack Iraq in March 2003, but it was a critical element. Many Americans believed that this was a war for oil or for corporations like Halliburton, but there's little direct evidence to support this claim and considerable evidence that casts doubt on it. Another interpretation views the war as the first step in a bold effort to transform the Middle East by spreading democracy. This view is correct, but as we will see, this remarkably ambitious scheme was inextricably linked to concerns about Israel's security. That is, why did the U.S. feel they needed to run around and turn the Middle East into a bunch of democracies? It's because of Israel, right? So in contrast to these alternative explanations, no blood for oil, all that kind of stuff, we argue the war was motivated, at least in good part, by a desire to make Israel more secure. A proper account of the lobby's role in encouraging the war is ultimately a question of evidence, and there is considerable evidence that Israel and pro-Israel groups, especially the neoconservatives, played important roles in the decision to invade. Note that a number of knowledgeable and well-respected individuals have said openly that the war was linked with Israel's security. Right? So they're not just like making this up. Key people have said this. Philip Zelikow, a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board between 2001 and 2003, executive director of the 9/11 Commission, and counselor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, told a University of Virginia audience on September 10, 2002, a year later, that Saddam was not a direct threat to the United States. The real threat, he argued, is the threat against Israel. He went on to say, and this is the threat that dare not speak its name, because the Europeans don't care deeply about that threat, and the American government doesn't want to lean too hard on it rhetorically, because it is not a popular sell. Excuse me a second. General Wesley Clark, August 2002. Those who favor this attack now will tell you candidly and privately that it is probably true that Saddam Hussein is no threat to the United States, but they are afraid that at some point he might decide, if he had a nuclear weapon, to use it against Israel. And here's Joe Klein with that phrase again in Time magazine. A stronger Israel is very much embedded in the rationale for war with Iraq. It is a part of the argument that dare not speak its name. Former Senator Ernest Hollings, May 2004. He asked, why did we invade the country? Iraq wasn't a direct threat to the U.S. The answer, which he said everyone knows, is because we want to secure our friend Israel. Now, he got attacked for this. A number of Jewish groups promptly labeled Hollings an anti-Semite, with the ADL calling his comments reminiscent of age-old anti-Semitic canards about a Jewish conspiracy to control and manipulate governments. Hollings admittedly adamantly rejected that charge, noting that he had long been a staunch supporter of Israel, and he was simply stating the obvious. He demanded that his critics apologize to me for talking about anti-Semitism, so that's fun. Hollings didn't back down. Yeah, this line about, an old anti-Semitic canard about a Jewish conspiracy to control and manipulate governments. What's the old line? You're not paranoid if people really are out to get you, right? It's not a canard if it's just the truth. So in Novak's case, Robert Novak, he referred to the war well before it happened as Sharon's War, and continues to do so today. I am convinced, he said in April 2007, years later, Israel made a large contribution to the decision to embark on this war. I know that on the eve of the war, Sharon said in a closed conversation with senators that if they could succeed in getting rid of Saddam Hussein, it would solve Israel's security problems. Michael Kinsley, fall of 2002, wrote, "The lack of public discussion about the role of Israel is the proverbial elephant in the room. Everybody sees it, no one mentions it." The reason for this reluctance, he observed, was the fear of being labeled an anti-Semite. And we talked about this use of the sort of the ultimate, what at that time was the ultimate rhetorical kill shot, which is labeling someone an anti-Semite. I think it's lost some of its power more recently, maybe. We'll see. I may find out, unfortunately. Anyway, so there's abundant evidence that Israel and the lobby played crucial roles in making that war happen. This is not to assert that either Israel or the lobby controls U.S. foreign policy. It is simply to say that they successfully pressed for a particular set of policies and were able, in a particular context, to achieve their objective. Had the circumstances been different, they would not have been able to get the U.S. to go to war. But without their efforts, America would probably not be in Iraq today, right? It's that combination of events and the lobby together, because they've wanted this for 10 years, but they finally got it after 9/11. Okay, so Israel and the Iraq War. Israel has always considered Iraq an enemy, but it became especially concerned about Iraq in the mid-70s, 1970s, when France agreed to provide Saddam with a nuclear reactor. For good reasons, Israel worried that Iraq might use the reactor as a stepping stone to building nuclear weapons. So in 1981, the Israelis bombed the Osirak reactor before it became operational. Despite the setback, Iraq continued to work on its nuclear program in dispersed and secret location. This situation helps explain Israel's enthusiastic support for the first Gulf War in 1991. Its main concern was not to push Iraqi troops out of Kuwait, the announced goal of that war, but to topple Saddam, and especially to make sure that Iraq's nuclear program was dismantled. Now, interestingly, Israel was a little bit mixed in a way about attacking Iraq. Some Israeli leaders told U.S. officials they thought Iran was the greater threat. They're like, look, if we're going to use this opportunity to go after somebody, could it be Iran? Having said that, Iraq was on their list, even if it wasn't the top of their, Iraq wasn't at the top of their list. And so they weren't opposed to it. They were just like, could you do Iran too, or Iran first or something? So Israeli leaders were worried that the United States might lose sight of the Iranian threat in its pursuit of Saddam. Once they realized that the Bush administration was countenancing a bolder scheme, one that called for winning quickly in Iraq and then moving on to Iran and Syria, then they began to push vigorously for an American invasion. They're like, oh, okay, this is just step one, and then you're going to get our other enemies too? Great, let's do it. So Israel did not initiate the campaign for war against Iraq. As will become clear, it was the neoconservatives in the United States who conceived that idea and were principally responsible for pushing it forward in the wake of September 11th. But Israel did join forces with the neocons to help sell the war. So, Israelis began their efforts in the spring of 2002. And this is a couple months before the Bush administration launched its own campaign to sell the Iraq war. Former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, you might have heard of him, came to Washington in mid-April 2002 and met with U.S. senators and the editors of the Washington Post to warn them that Saddam was developing nuclear weapons that could be delivered against the American homeland in suitcases or satchels, suitcase nukes. I remember that was a big point of discussion back then. Then, a few weeks later, Raanan Gisson, Sharon's spokesman, told a Cleveland reporter that if Saddam Hussein is not stopped now, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, we will have to deal with an Iraq that is armed with nuclear weapons, with an Iraq that has delivery systems for weapons of mass destruction. So this is the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction, rationale for invading Iraq that became the big pitch of the administration. In mid-May, Shimon Peres, the former Israeli PM, now serving as foreign minister, appeared on CNN where he said that Saddam Hussein is as dangerous as bin Laden, and the United States cannot sit and wait while he builds a nuclear arsenal. A month later, Ehud Barak, another former Israeli PM, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post recommending that the Bush administration should first of all focus on Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. Once he is gone, there'll be a different Arab world. So perhaps CBS best captured what was going on in the headline for its story: Israel to U.S., don't delay Iraq attack. So Perez and Sharon both made sure to emphasize that they did not want to be seen as urging the United States to act and that America should act according to its own judgment. They were well aware that some American commentators, like our hero Patrick Buchanan, had argued that the driving force behind the 91 Gulf War was the Israeli Defense Ministry and its amen corner in the United States. Denying any responsibility made good political sense, but there's no question, based on their own public comments, that by August 2002, Israel's leaders saw Saddam as a threat to the Jewish state and were encouraging the Bush administration to launch a war to remove him from power. So, little nuance here. They're pushing hard, but they kind of don't want to be seen to be pushing hard at the same time. They want the U.S. to do it. They want to push the U.S. to do it, but they want it to be on the down low, if at all possible, or at least not with the volume all the way up. News stories at the same time reported that Israeli intelligence officials have gathered evidence that Iraq is speeding up efforts to produce biological and chemical weapons. Perez told CNN that we think and know that he, Saddam, is on his way to acquiring a nuclear option. Israel was feeding these alarming reports about Iraq's WMD programs to Washington at a time when, by Sharon's own reckoning, strategic coordination between Israel and the U.S. has reached unprecedented dimensions. Following the invasion and the revelation that there were no WMD in Iraq, the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Israeli Knesset released separate reports revealing that much of the intelligence Israel gave to the Bush administration was false. So the Israeli Knesset, their Congress or whatever, right? They made a report saying, yeah, Israel shoveled bullshit to the U.S., So the authors are very fair and scholarly. They say, Israel's not the first state to push another country to do something. States facing external dangers often try to pass the buck to others, and the U.S. itself has a rich tradition of doing this. The U.S. backed Saddam Hussein in the 1980s in order to help contain the threat from revolutionary Iran. And then it armed and backed the Afghan Mujahideen following the Soviet invasion of the country in 1979. You can see how well these things that the U.S. does work out for us in the long run. The U.S. did not send its own troops to fight these wars. It merely did what it could to help others who had their own reasons for fighting do the heavy lifting. So it's not surprising that Israeli leaders were distressed when President Bush decided to seek UN Security Council authorization for war in September 2002. And they were even more worried when Saddam agreed to let UN inspectors back into Iraq. And by the way, this is a theme we'll see over and over again with these horrible imperial wars and wars done on the behalf of Israel. The other side will be being cooperative. They'll be like, hey, let's make peace. Let's end this. Let's not start it. And it just doesn't matter. They just roll right over all this and just attack anyway. On a visit to Moscow in late September, Sharon made it clear to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who was leading the charge for new inspections, that it was too late for them to be effective. So Israel opposed inspections. That is, they didn't want Iraq to get a chance to demonstrate its innocence, to demonstrate that it didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Israel said, hey, just trust us, they do, okay? Don't go in there and look. So in an article in The Forward in mid-September 2002, Mark Perlman wrote, Saddam Hussein's surprise acceptance of unconditional UN weapons inspections put Israel on the hot seat this week, forcing it into the open as the only nation actively supporting the Bush administration's goal of Iraqi regime change. Pressing ahead in the face of UN diplomacy, Israelis portrayed Saddam in the direst terms, often comparing him to Adolf Hitler. If the West did not stand up to Iraq, they claimed, it would be making the same mistake it made with Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Wow, that's an interesting and novel parallel to draw. Shlomo Avineri, a Israeli scholar, wrote in the LA Times that all who condemn the 1930s appeasement of Germany should reflect long and hard on whether a failure to act today against Iraq will one day be viewed the same way. The implication was unmistakable. Anyone who opposed invading Iraq, or pushed Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians for that matter, was an appeaser, just like Neville Chamberlain, and bound to be regarded as such by future generations. And is it really Bronze Age to want peace in the Middle East? Got to consider that, you know. Okay, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak wrote a New York Times op-ed in early September 2002 claiming that Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program provides the urgent need for his removal. He went on to warn that the greatest risk lies now in inaction. Benjamin Netanyahu published a similar piece a few weeks later in the Wall Street Journal titled "The Case for Toppling Saddam." Netanyahu declared, "Today, nothing less than dismantling his regime will do," adding that, "I believe I speak for the overwhelming majority of Israelis in supporting a preemptive strike against Saddam's regime," which he claimed was feverishly trying to acquire nuclear weapons. It's quite striking to me, you know. Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, New York Times op-ed, another former Prime Minister, Netanyahu, a Wall Street Journal article. Wondering if any of these papers, you know, there was like a piece by Saddam Hussein or from Saddam Hussein's government arguing their case. I don't remember, but I'm guessing there wasn't. Netanyahu's influence, of course, extended well beyond writing op-eds and appearing on television. If you didn't know about Netanyahu's background, this is still of relevant interest since he's the current prime minister. He had gone to high school, college, and graduate school in the U.S. Netanyahu speaks fluent English and is not only familiar with how the American political system works, but operates skillfully in it. He has close ties with neocons inside and out of the Bush administration. He has extensive contacts on Capitol Hill, where he has either spoken or testified on numerous occasions. So, yeah, Netanyahu is like, he knows his way around American political stuff, right? He knows how to operate the American political machine. Apart from Kuwait, which Saddam conquered in 1990, Israel was the only country outside of the U.S. where a majority of politicians and the public enthusiastically favored the Iraq War. Israel's enthusiasm for war eventually led some of its allies in America to tell Israeli officials to damp down their hawkish rhetoric, lest the war look like it was being fought for Israel. We got to sell these people it's about weapons of mass destruction or something. So quiet it down, guys, you know. Um, let's see. Yeah, a group of American political consultants circulated a memo called Talking About Iraq. They said if your goal is regime change, you must be much more careful with your language because of the potential backlash. You do not want Americans to believe that the war in Iraq is being waged to protect Israel rather than to protect America. Stop giving the game away, guys. Okay. The Israeli leader was worried by the growing perception that Israel was advocating a U.S. invasion of Iraq. In fact, Israel was. It just did not want its position to be widely known, right? Okay, so here we go. The lobby and the Iraq war. And this is the part where I don't think he mentions it, but I was reading LouRockwell.com at the time. We had a lady who was publishing articles on there anonymously about some of the things we're about to read because she was just happened to be working there as a member of the military and was seeing how the Office of Special Plans, which we're going to learn about, how it was operating and the people that were being allowed into these secure areas of the Pentagon and so forth. Later, that turned out to be Karen Kwiatkowski. You can still find her writing on LouRockwell.com, and she speaks sometimes to the Mises Institute. And she heroically tried to, kind of blow the whistle, but it didn't make any difference. But anyway, we were getting some really good intel at the time on those of us reading LouRockwell.com and what was happening in the lead up to the war. And he's going to tell you now some of the key players. They're going to tell you now. The driving force behind the Iraq War was a small band of neoconservatives who had long favored the energetic use of American power to reshape critical areas of the world. They'd advocated toppling Saddam since the mid-90s. This group included prominent officials in the Bush administration such as Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, F-E-I-T-H, Feith, the number 2 and 3 civilians in the Pentagon, Richard Pearl, sometimes referred to as the Prince of Darkness, by the way, and a mentor of, been learning about some people with Richard Pearl connections recently. Richard Pearl, Kenneth Edelman, James Woolsey, members of the influential Defense Policy Board, Scooter Libby, key person. He's the vice president's chief of staff. Remember, the vice president was very much in the pocket of the Israel lobby at this time. John Bolton, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and his special assistant, David Wormser. Elliot Abrams, in charge of Middle East policy at the National Security Council. And then some well-known journalists like Robert Kagan, Charles Krauthammer, William Crystal, William Safire. They were all working together. They were tightly organized. Organization, as Academic Agent has taught us, organization tends to win. Right? The small organized minority can win over the disorganized majority. It usually does, always does, pretty much. The appointment of a number of neoconservatives to top policy positions was seen by Israelis and their American allies as a very positive development. When Wolfowitz was selected to be Deputy Defense Secretary in January 2001, the Jerusalem Post reported that the Jewish and pro-Israel communities are jumping with joy. At about the same time, JINSA, which we've learned about, important organization in the Israel lobby, JINSA gave Wolfowitz its Henry M. Jackson Distinguished Service Award for promoting a strong partnership between Israel and the United States. And the Jerusalem Post, describing Wolfowitz as devoutly pro-Israel, named him its Man of the Year in 2003. Henry Jackson, I forget if I've pointed this out in this series yet, but he's a key figure. Interestingly, there's an outfit called the Henry Jackson Society, and you might find it interesting. Henry Jackson was a key figure, a patron saint of the neocons, a Democratic senator. You might find it interesting to know that a guy named Douglas Murray, you might heard of, was the associate director of the Henry Jackson Society, a neoconservative think tank, from 2011 to 2018. So connections are very tight here. Feith's role in shaping the case for war should also be understood in the context of his longstanding commitment to Israel and his prior association with hardline groups there. Feith has close ties with key organizations in the lobby like the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA, and the Zionist Organization of America. Feith was a co-author, along with Pearl and Wormser, of the famous Clean Break Report in June 1996. The Haaretz columnist Akiva Elder warned that Feith and Pearl are walking a fine line between their loyalty to American governments and Israeli interests. That's pretty funny. The Israeli paper is like, kind of looking like dual loyalty over there, guys. That's pretty anti-Semitic, Haaretz. You be careful there. John Bolton and Scooter Libby were staunch supporters of Israel as well. In May 2006, the Israeli ambassador to the UN jokingly described Bolton as a secret member of Israel's own team at the United Nations. And then there were neocons outside. So this is all people who actually had positions in the Bush administration, right? Bolton and Libby and Feith and Wormser and so forth. And Wolfowitz being a very important figure. But then there are people outside of the administration devoted to Israel and working with them in various ways. Consider the comments of the columnist Charles Krauthammer. He made these in June 10, 2002. He in his remarks, Krauthammer explicitly identified himself with Israel, indeed, as Israeli. Okay, so this is an American newspaper columnist saying, yeah, I'm basically an Israeli. Although many of the prominent neoconservatives were Jewish Americans with strong attachments to Israel, some of the leading members of the pro-war party were not. So you had Gentiles such as former CIA Director James Woolsey, former Secretary of Education William Bennett, and then let's see, and then key leaders of the major pro-Israel organizations lent their voices to the campaign for war. As President Bush attempted to sell the war in Iraq, America's most important Jewish organizations rallied as one to his defense. So there's unity, there's organization, there's a line. Everybody better, get in line and support this in the Israel lobby, right? They work in a very unified, organized, focused manner at critical junctures like this. Among the most outspoken proponents of the invasion was Mortimer Zuckerman, the chairman of the Conference of Presidents, who made frequent public statements promoting the war. In late August 2002, he wrote in U.S. News and World Report, where he is editor-in-chief, "Those who predict dire results if we try to unseat Saddam simply refuse to understand, as President Bush manifestly does, that if we opt to live with the nightmare, it will only get worse, much worse. The best medicine here, in other words, is preventive medicine." And wasn't it at that time that the whole notion of preventive war was being debated? Is it moral to attack someone to prevent them from doing something they might do later? Basically attack on a maybe. Okay, let's see. March 2007, most Jewish organizations have refused to speak out against the war. At times, they displayed support for the administration. And this might be like, well, of course they did, right? I mean, Israel wanted this. Okay, but most American Jews actually didn't have that kind of attitude toward the war itself. As you may know, American Jews are mostly secular, not all of them, but most of them. Most are more secular, and they're more so-called liberal or left-wing or whatever, right? So they, according to a 2007 Gallup study, based on the results of 13 polls taken since 2005, American Jews are significantly more opposed to the Iraq War, 77% of them, than the general American public, 52%. With respect to Iraq, the larger and wealthier pro-Israel organizations are clearly out of step with the broader population of American Jews. So that's interesting, isn't it? It's actually it's a hardline organized minority that is really what we think of as the Israel lobby. At least in regards to the Iraq War, most American Jews didn't want it. They opposed it. So although prominent Israeli leaders, the neoconservatives, many of the lobby's leaders were eager for the U.S. to invade Iraq, the broader American Jewish community was not. It would therefore be a cardinal error, the authors argue, to attribute the war in Iraq to Jewish influence or to blame the Jews for the war. Rather, the war was due in large part to the lobby's influence, and especially its neoconservative wing. And the lobby, as we have emphasized before, is not always representative of the larger community for which it often claims to speak. There's people who would quibble with the point that Mearsheimer and Walt are saying there, but I thought I'd, just go ahead and share their perspective. Okay, so time to sell the wars. They're pushing the administration, they're getting the administration to pivot from hunting down people who did 9/11 or whatever to invading Iraq for whatever random reason. And now it's time to persuade the public, right? So the neocons began their campaign to use military force to topple Saddam well before Bush became president. They caused a stir in early 1998 by organizing 2 letters to President Clinton calling for Saddam's removal from power. The first letter, January 1998, was written under the auspices of the Project for the New American Century, PNAC, and was signed by Elliott Abrams, John Bolton, Robert Kagan, William Crystal, Richard Pearl, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, among others. The second letter, February of the same year, 1998, was written under the auspices of the Committee for Peace and Security in the Gulf, an organization set up in 1990 by Richard Pearl, Prince of Darkness, Ann Lewis, and former Congressman Stephen Solares to lobby for the first Gulf War. It was signed by the individuals mentioned above who signed the first letter, along with Douglas Feith, Michael Ledeen, Bernard Lewis, Martin Peretz, and David Wormser, just to name a few. So in addition to those letters, the neocons and their allies in the lobby worked assiduously in 1998 to get Congress to pass the Iraq Liberation Act. And the Iraq Liberation Act said it should be the policy of the U.S. to support efforts to remove the regime headed by Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq and to promote the emergence of a democratic government to replace that regime. It's very strange, these things, like the Iraq Liberation Act. To me, that just sounds like a declaration of war, but they don't treat it as a declaration of war, but it kind of is. You know what I mean? And so the neocons were really enthusiastic about this because the act included $97 million to fund groups committed to overthrowing Saddam. And the main group they had in mind was something called the Iraqi National Congress, the INC, headed by a close associate of the neocons, Ahmed Chalabi. And the act passed by a vote of 360 to 38 and by unanimous consent in the Senate. Unanimous consent. President Clinton then signed it on October 31st, 1998. Now, Clinton didn't like it very much. He couldn't veto it because he felt he couldn't veto it. He didn't veto it because he was facing midterm elections and impeachment. So he was on the hot seat. So he's like, I can't deal with this fight. Clinton and his advisors, they didn't like this Chalabi guy. We'll hear a little bit more about that. But the neocons were unable to sell the idea of war against Iraq during the Clinton years, but they did succeed in making regime change in Baghdad an official goal of the U.S. government. So they got the legislation through saying that this is our goal, but it just sat there waiting, right? It wasn't acted on under Clinton. It wasn't until 9/11 and George W. Bush, it all fell in place, and suddenly that act became not just a wish, but an action, right? Yeah, and we say Clinton, but they weren't able to generate much enthusiasm for invading Iraq in the early months of the Bush administration. That is, until September 11th, right? Richard Pearl later said that the advocates for toppling Saddam were losing the arguments inside the administration during this early period. So before 9/11, they were not getting their way, just like they hadn't with Clinton. Or, they hadn't gotten the action they wanted from Clinton, at least. Bush's main foreign policy advisor during his campaign for president, Condoleezza Rice, wrote a prominent article in Foreign Affairs in early 2000, saying that the U.S. could live with a nuclear-armed Iraq. Rice declared that Saddam's conventional military power had been severely weakened and said that there need be no sense of panic about his regime. So she's a foreign policy advisor to the campaign, and she's saying, hey, cool it about Iraq. It's fine. So in this early period, 1998 through up until September 2011, 2001, none of the other groups that are sometimes blamed for the war, such as oil companies, weapons manufacturers, Christian Zionists, or defense contractors like Kellogg, Brown, and Root, were making noise about invading Iraq. In the beginning, the neoconservatives were largely alone. They had a little humble dream, right? They were all alone with their dream. As important as the neocons were as the chief architects of the war, they'd been unable to persuade either Clinton or Bush to support an invasion. They needed help to achieve their aim, and that help arrived on 9/11. Specifically, the events of that tragic day led Bush and Cheney to reverse course and become strong proponents of a preventive war to topple Saddam. Robert Kagan said, September 11th is the turning point, not anything else. This is not what Bush was on September 10th. 9/11 was the new context to sell their old view of American foreign policy. Possibly their greatest advantage was that they had, in Kagan's words, a ready-made approach to the world at a time when both the president and the vice president were trying to make sense of an unprecedented disaster that seemed to call for radically new ways of thinking about international politics. And we see this again and again in politics. There's a great article, a lengthy article by Murray Rothbard, World War I is intellectual fulfillment, or fulfillment of the intellectuals, something like that, showing how they had all these crazy schemes to sort of move the U.S. in a more socialist direction, basically. And they weren't necessarily getting anywhere with them. And then World War I came along, and that gave them the opportunity to push this stuff through, right? And you see this again and again. People will just be prepared with a plan, and then when the crisis comes, the politicians look around in a panic, confused, and somebody's like, hey, I've already got a plan all set up. Here, just execute on it, right? Fortune favors the prepared mind, as they say. Wolfowitz's behavior is especially revealing. At a key meeting with Bush at Camp David on September 15th, 2001, 4 days after, Wolfowitz advocated attacking Iraq before Afghanistan. Before Afghanistan. So the terrorists are in Afghanistan, and he's like, how about we just attack Iraq instead? Even though there was no evidence that Saddam was involved in the attacks on the U.S., and bin Laden was known to be in Afghanistan. Wolfowitz was so insistent on conquering Iraq that 5 days later, Cheney had to tell him to stop agitating for targeting Saddam. According to one Republican lawmaker, Wolfowitz was like a parrot, bringing Iraq up all the time. It was getting on the president's nerves. And at that time, Bush rejected Wolfowitz's advice and chose to go after Afghanistan instead. But war with Iraq was now regarded as a serious possibility. Other neocons were hard at work. We don't have the full story yet, but there's considerable evidence that scholars like Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami of Johns Hopkins University played an important role in convincing Vice President Cheney to favor war against Iraq. Surely the most important influence on the vice president was his chief of staff, Scooter Libby. And what did somebody say? Oh, they were talking about the Minnesota Senator Scoop Jackson. Anyway, Scoop Jackson, Scooter Libby. Why do they have these like cute kid nicknames? Anyway, Scooter Libby was one of the most powerful individuals in the administration, and his views on Iraq were similar to those of his close friend and longtime mentor, Paul Wolfowitz. Shortly after 9/11, the New York Times reported that some senior administration officials, led by Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby, are pressing for the earliest and broadest military campaign against not only the Osama bin Laden network in Afghanistan, but also against other suspected terrorist bases in Iraq and in Lebanon's Bekaa region. The vice president's position helped convince Bush by early 2002 that the U.S. would probably have to take Saddam out. So, key player right there next to the vice president, Scooter Libby, and then the vice president in turn influences Bush to change his course, right? So two other considerations show how profoundly important the neocons inside the administration were for making the Iraq War happen. It's no exaggeration to say that they were not just determined, they were obsessed with removing Saddam from power. A Washington Post journalist described Colin Powell returning from White House meetings during the run-up to the Iraq War, rolling his eyes and saying, geez, what a fixation about Iraq. Now, secondly, there was little enthusiasm for going to war against Iraq inside the State Department, the intelligence community, or the uniformed military. So this is interesting here because this is a case where the deep state was not really up for this, but the neocons got their way anyway. Okay, see, evidently you don't always lose when you go up against the deep state. So most of them in the State Department, intelligence community, uniformed military were not up for it. But there were two key outliers in the State Department, John Bolton and David Wurmser, both prominent neocons who had close ties to the White House. George Tenet, the head of the CIA, also supported this, but he wasn't a forceful advocate. He was just like, okay, sure. Few individuals within the intelligence community found the case for war convincing, which is why, as discussed below, the neocons established their own intelligence units. Crazy what went down back then, guys. I know I've got some younger audience who didn't live through it or wouldn't remember any of this. It was crazy what they did. They set up their own little like parallel government, a government within the government. So who were the war hawks? They were mostly in the administration. They were mainly high-level civilians in the White House and the Pentagon, and they were almost all neocons. So over the next 18 months after 9/11, the neocons waged an unrelenting PR campaign to win support for invading Iraq. April 3rd, 2002, they released yet another open letter to Bush, which clearly linked Israel's security with a war to topple Saddam. The letter starts by commending the president for his strong stance in support of the Israeli government as it engages in the president's campaign to fight terrorism. It then argues that the U.S. and Israel share a common enemy and are fighting the same war. The letter concludes with the following message: Israel's fight against terrorism is our fight. Israel's victory is an important part of our victory. For reasons both moral and strategic, we need to stand with Israel in its fight against terrorism. The basic aim of the letter was to portray Arafat, bin Laden, and Saddam as critical parts of a looming menace that threatened both Israel and the United States. Not only did this depiction of a shared and growing danger justify a close relationship between America and Israel, it also justified the U.S. treating these three individuals, Arafat, bin Laden, Saddam, as mortal enemies and backing Israel's hardline response to the Second Intifada. The neocons made frequent reference to the 1930s and Munich, comparing Saddam with Hitler, and opponents of the war like Brent Scowcroft, Senator Chuck Hagel, with appeasers like Neville Chamberlain. It's almost a running joke how every enemy of the U.S. gets compared to Hitler, including my favorite, Manuel Noriega, the Hitler-like leader of Panama. Yep. He was Hitler for a day. I remember, though few others do. One might argue that this analysis exaggerates the impact that open letters to presidents, newspaper columns, books, and op-eds can have on the policy-making process, but this perspective is wrong. The signatories of these various letters, written to Presidents Bush and Clinton, are powerful individuals who have connections and influence with important policymakers and lawmakers on Capitol Hill, some of whom they had worked closely with in the course of their careers. A number of the individuals who signed the earlier letters to Clinton, including Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Feith, became key policymakers in the Bush administration. Thus, the signatories of the letters written to Bush in the period between 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq were not shouting into a void. So, coming from sort of an elite theory point of view, right? Coming from an elite theory point of view, he's saying, yeah, open letter, this is like claiming that democracy works or marching the streets works or whatever. He's like, no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that these are elite applying pressure, people with power applying pressure. It isn't just like an open letter signed by random citizens, right? These are not random people. This is an elite in action. That's the significance of this stuff. So these views were taken seriously by influential people inside and outside of the US government, as were the articles that appeared in neoconservative magazines like the Weekly Standard. By making war seem both necessary and beneficial, by portraying potential opponents as soft on terror, by linking America's fate to Israel's through the repetition of familiar moral and strategic arguments, these efforts helped stifle serious discussion about the pros and cons of an invasion and were an important part of the broader campaign for war. And I remember it just became a frenzy. It wasn't any kind of like measured, they talk about, in democracy, we're gonna reason with each other, right? We're gonna have an open debate and let truth out, and let bad ideas get the air and light on them, and then that'll disinfect and all that stuff. No. I remember what it was like back then. It was nuts. I had someone. Well, I have to be careful what I say here. I have someone who I know personally who told me I should leave the United States because I opposed the Iraq War. He said it to me and my wife as we were sitting there together. People went nuts. It was very emotional. It was not a reasonable discussion about what's in the interest of the U.S. or whatever. It was hysteria. Okay, now, little geeky deep dive here, but this was of great interest. And again, Karen Kwiatkowski really was helpful. Lucy? So, fixing the intelligence on Iraq. So, as already mentioned, later, even the Knesset said, yeah, there was some BS that got fed from Israel. It's worth knowing a little bit about how it was done. We actually knew it was happening at the time, courtesy of Karen Kwiatkowski anonymously reporting from inside through LouRockwell.com. But it's just nuts what they did. A key part of the PR campaign to win support for invading Iraq was the manipulation of intelligence information in order to make Saddam look like an imminent threat. Scooter Libby was an important player in this endeavor, visiting the CIA several times to pressure analysts to find evidence that would make the case for war. He also helped prepare a detailed briefing on the Iraq threat in early 2003 that was pushed on Colin Powell, who was then preparing his infamous presentation to the UN Security Council. And if you ever get a chance, if you're interested in these things, just watch a little clip of Colin Powell at the UN. Colin Powell later regretted what he said there very much. Libby was drawing only the worst conclusions from fragments and silky threads. Although Powell discarded Libby's most outlandish claims, Powell's UN presentation was still riddled with errors, as Powell now acknowledges. Two other organizations that were created after 9/11 and helped manipulate intelligence reported directly to Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feith. The Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group was tasked to find links between Al-Qaeda and Iraq that the intelligence community supposedly missed. So we've got this massively expensive intelligence community, right? And they don't come up with the answer we want. And so they just make a new group that'll give the answer we want. The Office of Special Plans, this is the one I remember learning so much about at the time, the OSP. The Office of Special Plans was directed to find evidence that could be used to sell the war against Iraq. It was headed by Abram Shulsky, a neoconservative long associated with Wolfowitz, and its ranks included several recruits from pro-Israel think tanks like Michael Rubin from the American Enterprise Institute, Michael Makovsky, who had worked for then Prime Minister Sharon Peres after graduating from college. OSP relied heavily on information from Ahmed Chalabi and other Iraqi exiles, and it had close connections to various Israeli sources. The neocons in the Pentagon and the White House not only relied heavily on Chalabi and his fellow exiles for intelligence about Iraq, they also championed him as Iraq's future leader after Saddam was gone. The CIA and the State Department, on the other hand, considered Chalabi dishonest and unreliable and kept him at arm's length. That severe judgment has now been vindicated, as we know that Chalabi and the INC, his organization, fed the U.S. false information, and his relations with the U.S. occupation forces soon deteriorated, with Chalabi later being accused of providing classified information to Iran. So, why did neocons embrace Chalabi that other parts of the deep state did not like at all? Chalabi had gone to great lengths to have ties to the lobby. He had especially close links with JINSA, for example. He cultivated close ties with pro-Israel organizations like AIPAC, AEI, the Hudson Institute, and WINUP. In return for their support, he pledged to foster good relations with Israel once he gained power. I mean, this is pretty simple, right? Nudge Unit says, Chalabi, I remember him being trotted out all over mainstream media prior to the war. Yep. It's pretty simple. He says, look, Israel, get me in power, and Iraq's going to be your friend under my leadership. I mean, pretty simple deal. Pretty attractive deal, I guess, for Israel, right? Now, the neocons and their allies did not operate in a vacuum, and they did not lead the United States to war by themselves. But the lobby's actions were a necessary but not sufficient condition for the war. So the authors don't believe we would have gone to Iraq without all this crazy planting of false intelligence and lobbying and pushing and having neocons and all over the Bush administration and so forth. New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, in May 2003, he said, Iraq was the war the neoconservatives wanted, the war the neoconservatives marketed. I could give you the names of 25 people, all of whom are at the moment within a 5-block radius of this office in Washington, D.C., who, if you exiled them to a desert island a year and a half ago, the Iraq war would not have happened. Again, going back to academic agents' populist illusion, small organized minority. According to Thomas Friedman, literally 25 people could have made the difference if they'd been removed from the picture. Or they did make the difference by being in the picture. Okay, I'm not sure. I feel like this is running long. He talks about, was Iraq a war for oil? And let's see, I'm going to skip over this a bit and just give you the main argument. Problems with that argument. Saddam was eager to sell his oil to any customer willing to pay for it. So he wasn't like withholding oil. Okay. Oil interests, there's no evidence that oil interests were pushing the Bush administration to invade Iraq. Saudi Arabia opposed using American force against Iraq. The oil companies did not lobby for the 2003 war. Most of them thought it was a foolish idea. It isn't war, Peter Beinart in the New Republic in September 2002, it isn't war that the American oil industry has been lobbying for all these years. It's the end of sanctions. The oil companies, as is almost always the case, wanted to make money, not war. So it wasn't really them. It was the neocons and the Israel lobby. Okay, so they titled this chapter Iraq and the Dream of Regional Transformation. So what's this dream of regional transformation? That is, Iraq is the first step of a larger plan for the Middle East. President Bush spoke with similar enthusiasm about regional transformation as he made the case for war against Iraq. On February 26, 2003, he told an audience at AEI that the U.S. aims to cultivate liberty and peace in the Middle East. He emphasized that the world has a clear interest in the spread of democratic values because stable and free nations do not breed the ideologies of murder. They encourage the peaceful pursuit of a better life, and there are hopeful signs of a desire for freedom in the Middle East. Furthermore, he claimed success in Iraq could also begin a new stage for Middle Eastern peace and set in motion progress towards a truly democratic Palestinian peace. This ambitious strategy, grounded in an almost theological belief in the transformative power of freedom, was a dramatic departure from previous U.S. policy. And there was no indication before 9/11 that Bush or Cheney would embrace this kind of approach. Both men, as well as National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, were on record as being opposed to the ambitious kind of nation building that was at the heart of regional transformation. And Bush had sharply criticized the Clinton administration for its emphasis on nation building during the 2000 campaign. I remember, I was like, oh, great, George W. Bush, he's against nation building. Well, maybe we'll cool it off with the empire stuff. Yeah, well, you know how these things usually go. You vote for peace and you get war every time. The critical driving forces behind this major change in U.S. Middle East policy were Israel and the neoconservatives in the lobby. The headline says it all. President's dream, changing not just regime, but a region. A pro-U.S. democratic area is a goal that has Israeli and neoconservative roots. That's a Wall Street Journal story from March 2003. Let's see, February 2003, Haaretz, senior IDF officers and those close to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, such as National Security Advisor Ephraim Halevi, paint a rosy picture of the wonderful future Israel can expect after the war. They envision a domino effect, with the fall of Saddam Hussein followed by that of Israel's other enemies, Arafat, Hassan Nasrallah, Bashar Assad, the Ayatollah in Iran, and maybe even Muammar Gaddafi. Imagine. Along with these leaders will disappear terror and weapons of mass destruction. So some might argue that Israel's leaders are too sophisticated and experienced to believe in a deus ex machina and countenance such an ambitious scheme, and too familiar with the complexity of their region to believe it could succeed. But in fact, Israel's leaders have a long history of favoring remarkably ambitious plans to remake the local map. The original Zionist dream of reestablishing a Jewish state, where none had existed for nearly 2 millennia, was nothing if not ambitious. David Ben-Gurion had hoped to seize all of the West Bank, part of Lebanon, and portions of Egypt in the 1956 Suez War. Similarly, Ariel Sharon believed the invasion of Lebanon in 1982 would lead to the creation of a pro-Israel Christian state there and vanquish the PLO once and for all, thereby cementing Israel's control of the occupied territories. So they dream big, and they don't get everything they dream, but they get more than a lot of people would have imagined when they first dreamed that dream, right? So pro-Israel groups, and not only neocons, have long been interested in having the U.S. military directly involved in the Middle East so that it can help protect Israel. They're especially interested in seeing large numbers of American troops permanently stationed there. Prior to the Iraq War, most U.S. forces were kept over the horizon out of harm's way in the Middle East. Washington maintained a favorable balance of power by playing local powers against each other, which is why the Reagan administration supported Saddam against revolutionary Iran during the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. This policy changed after the first Gulf War, when the Clinton administration adopted a strategy of dual containment. Instead of using Iran and Iraq to balance each other, with the U.S. shifting sides as needed, the new strategy called for stationing substantial American forces in the region to contain both of them at once. The father of dual containment was Martin Indyk, who first articulated the strategy at WINEP in '93, and then implemented it as director for Near East and South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. Dual containment was a policy adopted largely in response to Israel's security concerns. Specifically, Israel made it clear to the Clinton administration that it was willing to move ahead in the peace process only if it felt reasonably secure from Iran. We promise we'll be nice to the Palestinians if you just do all this stuff for us, right? By 2002, when invading Iraq had become a front burner issue, regional transformation had become an article of faith among neoconservatives, who in turn helped make it the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. Thus, Israeli leaders, neoconservatives, and the Bush administration all saw war with Iraq as the first step in an ambitious campaign to remake the Middle East. Okay, thanks for those who stuck with me, moving through material very fast. Here's the conclusion of the chapter about Iraq and the conclusion of the show today. Hope you found it interesting. If you weren't there, I wanted to give you a, kind of gallop through it, but a lightning summary of the crazy stuff that went on with the planted intelligence right there at the Pentagon. Israeli people with, shall we say, a very strong loyalty to Israel right there all over the Bush administration. The deep state defeated. President Bush blinked. They won. They won this one. So let's wrap it up. The Bush administration's plans for Iraq and the wider region have been a stunning failure. Iran has been the main beneficiary of this ill-conceived adventure, and it seems as determined as ever to acquire a nuclear capability. We may be witnessing the birth pangs of a new Middle East, to use Secretary of State Rice's regrettable phrase, but it will almost certainly be more unstable and dangerous than the one that existed before the U.S. invaded Iraq. The war in Iraq, the authors argue, has not been good for Israel either, especially since it has strengthened Iran's hand in the region. Indeed, the Forward reported in early 2007 that there is a growing chorus of voices in Israel who are saying that the Jewish state could find itself in more danger now that Saddam has been removed from power. Buyer's remorse. Okay. Amatzia Baram, an Israeli expert, he said, "If I knew then what I know today, January 2007, I would not have recommended going to war, because Saddam was far less dangerous than I thought." He admitted the invasion had produced much, much more terrorism than I expected. Yuval Diskin, the head of Shin Bet, Israel's domestic security service, said in February 2006, "I'm not sure we won't miss Saddam." Well, it's a little late now. You hung him or whatever you guys did to him. The neoconservatives and the Israelis, of course, believed that the road to Jerusalem ran through Baghdad. Once the United States won in Iraq, they believed, the Palestinians would make peace on Israel's terms. But the bipartisan Iraq Study Group, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and many others believe the opposite is true. The road to Baghdad runs through Jerusalem. In other words, creating a viable Palestinian state will help the U.S. deal with Iraq and other regional problems. Once again, surprising detail, Blair is actually, I thought of him as just right there with Bush doing neocon things. He was actually a little more moderate in certain ways, or not as in alignment with the Israel lobby, I guess I could say. The Bush administration faces growing pressure to pull out of Iraq, but Israeli leaders have encouraged it to stay and finish the job. Remember, the book came out in 2008. Why? Because these leaders believe that a U.S. withdrawal would jeopardize Israel's security. In a region where impressions are important, countries must be careful not to demonstrate weakness and surrender to extremists. We've heard this so many times. We can't demonstrate weakness, so we have to keep doubling down on the stupidest stuff, Anyway, some Israelis and their American allies have tried to rewrite the historical record to absolve Israel of any responsibility for the Iraq disaster. In March 2007, the editor of the Jerusalem Post, David Horowitz, wrote about the false notion that Israel encouraged the U.S. to fight the Iraq War. This whole chapter documented that that's in fact exactly what they did. So, victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. They're all, after Iraq became a disaster, they all wanted to trying to deny paternity. Oh yeah, we weren't for that, sure. But in fact, during this brief window of opportunity, key Israelis and their American allies began to pressure the Bush administration to bring U.S. power to bear on Syria and Iran, in the hope that these two rogue states would suffer the same fate as Saddam Hussein's regime. So, Iraq was a disaster, but let's do more of it. And that leads us to where we'll go next time. if I decide I want to spend time on it. I probably should. I mean, Syria just went down this year. We can see what they were trying to do way back 20 years ago. And then, yeah, in the chapter on Iran, I might skip the Lebanon war, but Syria and Iran seem pretty relevant because of what just happened with Syria and what they want to happen with Iran. Okay, so we'll stop there. Thank you, everyone. Did get some, let's see, Maddie G says just some appreciation, a super chat, thank you. And then on a tip on Subscribestar, RD8 says, reading up on the signatories to PNAC is quite the rabbit hole. There's a lot there for those with the eyes to see. Yes, absolutely. PNAC, the clean break memorandum or whatever that was, seeing who the authors were, the positions they got in later in the Bush administration and so forth. It's very enlightening, shall we say. Let me see if there's anything else I want to respond to real quick. Didn't have a whole lot of comments here. Alex Lang pointed out that Senator Scoop Jackson, of much beloved memory to the neocons, was a Minnesota senator. FBI informant says Jews are secular yet extremely attached to their ethnic identity. Yeah, we covered this earlier in the series in the Israel lobby, that it's like, as I quipped recently, Israel is Jesus for the Jews. That's the thing that they put their identity around that matters to them. In the absence of a religious identity, Israel becomes a central part of identity. Let's see. Yeah, okay, I think I got everything. Okay, thanks very much. Anyone who sticks through this, you're one of my people. This is some deep dive stuff, but I think it matters. So, okay, let's see if the outro works, that I just got this all reconfigured. Thank you all. I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing next week, so we'll see. But hopefully something. Bye.